So Austin, we have a lot of courageous decisions to talk about today. I think it seems like a natural starting point based on our earlier conversation is around your decision with regards to entrepreneurship. Kind of your pivotal moment of your life, you're trying to figure out which way to go. And let's just pick up the story there and walk through a series of courageous decisions that you made in your career and that I know will bless others with wisdom and others want to hear. So I'll hand the baton to you, my friend. And why don't we start with what went into that decision?
Sure. So there's kind of two specific inflection points for me in my journey or battle with entrepreneurship, depending on how you look at it. Should we start? Maybe it's helpful to start with the first time I had explored entrepreneurship, or should we start with the recent news?
Whichever you want. You can book it either way. Sure.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll frame it like that then. So around the time that I was wrapping up in school, getting my undergrad in economics, I had this product that I was making to help with running because I was a big endurance athlete. And I was also, as a kid, I craved sweet things all the time. And my challenge was I never found a way to kind of mesh those two lifestyles, and just wanting to do it all. I started experimenting in my dorm room and I created this product that was like a frozen dessert, but it was 2010 before non-dairy was a thing and before non-ice cream frozen desserts had really made their way into the zeitgeist. So I had this product that I was using that was full of protein and carbs and healthy fats that would fuel my adventures. And I eventually shared it with some friends at school who thought it was really great. And I was fortunate enough that one of them was in a family that had done some investing before on small little retail ideas like this. So they gave a very, very tiny cash infusion to the business that allowed us to explore it for a couple of years. And in that process, I'll kind of skip past all the learnings about myself while I was finishing up my degree. And I remember in my finals for my senior year, this was a couple of years into the business, I slept like 3 hours that whole week because we were preparing for the biggest expo we had done so far with our products. We were bringing it into this big hall with all these different booths that were set up for folks to come in and try these samples of these new innovative food products. And of course, because it coincided with finals, I was doing this crazy thing where I would mix all these ingredients together. I put them in the blender and then I put it on the stovetop. And while it's on the stovetop, I've got my textbook open and I'm thumbing through it. And then first thing in the morning, I wake up, I try the batch that's cooled overnight to see if it works. And if it's good, then I get right back into finishing up the essay that I was trying to write. So I went along with that lifestyle for about 2 years until I had an opportunity, really a crossroads, to join LinkedIn.
Was it exciting? I mean, it sounds like a lot of adrenaline, right? I mean, you're an athlete, you're used to endurance, you're used to some extreme conditioning. And for our audience, you went to Dartmouth and Oxford. So these aren't easy schools. I mean, these are rigorous academic institutions, right? So was it exciting? I mean, you got money, you got a student, you're an entrepreneur.
Oh yeah. In fact, when I look back on it, of course, hindsight is 2020. It was probably the most exciting point of my life, particularly when I was just starting to get into it. When I went off to Oxford and I did an exchange program there for a year while studying abroad via Dartmouth. And during that time, it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that my life was not just contained in that small little corner of New Hampshire. But there were all these different things I could do with my life, all these different people around the world that were living these alternative lifestyles really appealed to me. So that was where the seed was kind of planted. Oh, maybe I could be the ice cream man. But kind of the dark side of that was also, if you look at my academic performance at Dartmouth over the years, you can clearly spot, if you were to plot my GPA on a line graph over each quarter, you can clearly see where I had taken that plunge. And all of a sudden I went from a 4.0 student to kind of just gently declining. Fortunately, still, I graduated, barely made the cusp to graduate with honors. But in my last couple quarters, I was just like hanging on for dear life. Sure. So obsessed with this business. But really, at that point, I had a critical decision to make, because I presumably could have continued on and tried to build what later could have been maybe a very exciting alternative brand. And who knows what that would look like today, 10 years later. But because I got this cold outreach to join at that time what was a very fast growing, recently IPO'd hot tech company in the Bay Area, it was the first chance where first chance to really consider what I wanted out of life and what my journey with entrepreneurship was going to be, or in another sense, what that struggle would look like. Because we hear about all these stories of, the breakout entrepreneur that drops out of the fancy school and goes and grows the business from scratch and then becomes a billionaire. And I also knew at the time, maybe this probably gets into one of the principles to how I've made a lot of these decisions throughout my career, but I was trying to de-risk that possibility as much as possible. The possibility of finding the success that I wanted in my life and making the impact that I wanted to make. And part of that decision...
Are you saying you wanted to de-risk that? The de-risk that would be the outcome?
I wanted to de-risk the journey into entrepreneurship by getting a little bit more kind of concrete skills. So, of course, at that point, I was committed to finishing my degree at Dartmouth, notwithstanding the fact that my grades had been slipping more and more each quarter. And I decided that I was going to close the chapter of entrepreneurship at that point and take a step into this very well-defined kind of spoke on a wheel sales role at LinkedIn, which turned out to be transformational in its own right. But now I'll kind of skip forward. We can get back to that point because there's a lot that happened in between there. But 10 years later, I still am dreaming of that time that I woke up a week after finals and tasted what I knew was going to be the final recipe of our spiced sweet potato ice cream. And that was, I think I gained 20 pounds or so that quarter, not just because of the stress of finishing up academically, but I would go with my little coffee shop salary because I was working in a coffee shop at the time, and I'd spend 80% of what I made on ice cream, just other Ben and Jerry's ice cream, small no-name or kind of local, very very small brand creameries, ice creams, and I would taste them and I would rank them on consistency and flavor and all these different attributes about for instance, how the ice crystals would recrystallize once they were unfrozen and frozen again, et cetera, et cetera. And at that one moment, I remember just that feeling of accomplishment and of true fulfillment of tasting that first bite after it had cooled overnight and realizing this is the one, this is what we're going to bring to Expo. So 10 years later, now I'm reclaiming the vision of that. So last week, I just gave my notice to walk away from this next chapter, which has been the professional chapter of my career, and start the return to entrepreneurship.
But that wasn't a foregone conclusion, right? When you made that decision to join LinkedIn, or was it? Was there a master plan, or was it, I had a great run with this, but I want to go, the allure of San Francisco, the allure of the Bay Area, the allure of a hot tech startup. I know you said de-risk entrepreneurship, but was that, tell me a little bit about that. I mean, so you move into LinkedIn. Had you ever sold before? I mean, had selling been part of your repertoire?
So actually, yes. And this might seem kind of funny, but I really sharpened my teeth, so to speak, selling at Nordstrom. Oh. And the way that I do it, because I came in selling women's sunglasses when I must have been the minimum age required to even get a job at Nordstrom. And I think it was like the 5th retail business that I had applied for, because all of them were like, you've no experience. Like, why are we going to hire you? But Nordstrom had this environment where you would make whatever your commission was. And if you failed to make a certain amount, then they would essentially pay you minimum wage. So it was 100% commissioned role as a result. And that also meant that it was very competitive. And that kind of lit a fire in me that I had never experienced before, especially in a professional environment like that. So I sold at Nordstrom for a 3-month period while I was taking a summer off between semesters at Dartmouth. And I loved it. In particular, I found that I could increase my sale price by taking customers into different departments and doing what they called cross-selling. Of course, to me at the time, that was a very fancy word that I'd never heard before. I was just selling shoes because somebody would say, I'm going on a beach vacation. I want a new pair of sunglasses. And I just asked, well, what else are you going to wear? And then the journey would begin.
Right.
So I came back to Nordstrom a year and a half later and did another stint there during the holidays and sold men's furnishings. and kind of realized like I really enjoy this sales thing, and I was getting great performance ratings, getting great customer review ratings. So that kind of signaled to me that there might be something worth exploring within sales, and that my angle into entrepreneurship, or my superpower, if you will, could be something like that. But that was the only experience that I had when I came to LinkedIn. That was the only way that I'd seen sales before.
But Nordstrom is a world-class brand, right? It's a world-class brand. It's their professionalism as well. I've had friends that have had epic careers at Nordstrom, going very high in the company. And they started off, I think, in high school, at 14 or 15, whatever it was, and just stayed with the company for 40 years, so to speak. Great training ground, though. And if you can do that type of selling, I mean, that kind of visual, face-to-face, customer engagement, not a bad thing to take with you, right? I mean, I wonder if there's some benefits to you to add that others didn't have within LinkedIn.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference was when the first role that I had at LinkedIn, as many folks that enter SaaS sales was sales development. So rather than owning deals end to end and taking a customer from first needs analysis, discovery through demo, all the way to negotiations and closing, and the only thing that we did was just generate leads. We would just find customers. We'd do some basic discovery to determine if they were qualified, and then we'd pass them to an account executive. And that is a brutal job. Like, man, a lot of companies will set cold call targets. You're making 40 to 50 cold calls a day. Most of the time, you're dealing with rejection. In rare cases, maybe 10% of the time, you get the good old just click as soon as you introduce yourself, or you get a couple expletives and then the click, which I always appreciated. But that is where the training at Nordstrom really came in handy, because at Nordstrom, there was kind of a sink or swim moment where maybe a week into selling sunglasses, one of the more tenured associates said like, hey, but you got to like go talk to people. You see someone browsing, you have to go introduce yourself. Yeah. But there's also an art to it, right? Because there's the fact that you need to go introduce yourself, but nobody wants to deal with the pushy salesperson that keeps handing you merchandise. So I needed to kind of find my own voice as a consultative sales rep that was there to help with questions and sort of lead the horse to water. But that also put me face to face with rejection all the time, and definitely made it a lot easier to get through that at LinkedIn.
Is it? Yeah, because you develop some thick skin by the time you go to LinkedIn. Is that what I'm hearing?
100%.
Yeah, and your voice and your approach. And so there are things you could take that you already had and then adapt them to your new environment, I think is what I'm hearing you say. Yeah. And so you started having quite a bit of success, right? I mean, it didn't take long for you to catch on how to make an impact. Yeah.
So at LinkedIn, and also to kind of bring it back with a question that you'd asked earlier about whether there was a grandmaster plan. I had known from the moment that I took the offer at LinkedIn that my journey was going to at some point take me back to entrepreneurship. I didn't know when, but I kind of had this thought that I would go into the corporate worlds and kind of just learn from the school of hard knocks and learn from folks that had seen success before in the tech industry. And then I would take those lessons back with me to try building something from scratch. So it appeared to me at the time that sales was a great place to start, because, this is my 22, 23-year-old brain was thinking, okay, I'm going to have to create a business idea. I'm going to have to pitch it to investors. I'm going to have to pitch it to prospective talent that I might recruit. Sales is going to be a big part of this early journey. And if that's the thing that I can do well, that is a great foundation upon which to start building. I can try to find the rest of the talent that we need. So yes, to bring it back to the other thing that you mentioned, I did find very fast success in sales there. And I was fortunate enough too that maybe this was the angle that LinkedIn got me with, but the program that I entered, which is now called the Business Leadership Program, starts with 2 rotations, one of which is typically in recruiting. So you're using Recruiter, you're on LinkedIn, sourcing candidates, sending them emails, and trying to generate calls with recruiters to close the candidates. Okay. The other was in customer service, which was a very operational role. So by the time I'd made it to the sales team there, which was about 6 months in after those rotations, I had that kind of 0 to 1 experience with recruiting. Granted, it was very, very limited, but I'd at least seen how LinkedIn worked. And that was a skill that I'd wanted to develop. And I also was in this rotational program with 20 other students that were exceptionally driven. I have no idea why they hired me for that first role, to be honest. I still to this day kind of wonder what it was that they had seen in that first interview, because everybody that was around me in that class was so exceptionally bright, and all of them wanted to be the best. So I think that also helped to prime me for what laid ahead, because by the time we made it to sales, my competitive fire was burning the brightest it ever had before. I wanted to be number one so badly. Yeah. That was all that I wanted. And I had this basic toolkit that I had sort of earned from the time at Nordstrom and from a little bit of exposure to recruiting. So over the course of the next couple years, I kind of made it a point to myself that I needed to be number one in every single sales position that I had at LinkedIn.
What was it like to live with that type of pressure? You know, that type. How did that show up in your life?
Oh man, well, it was tough. It was really tough. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was tough in a few different ways. First off, my work-life balance was horrible. I mean, it just wasn't. It was a work balance. Yeah. All I wanted to do was work. I would wake up at 6 a.m. and I had all these different news alerts that were set on various news sites to see if companies got funding and might be hiring. Because if they were hiring, they might be a good fit for LinkedIn's talent solutions, which is the product that I was selling. And in many cases, by 6:10 a.m., I had 3 emails out to those companies asking them if they wanted to chat. And in some cases, I had a call with the CEO by 8 a.m. So that would happen every single weekday. On the weekends, I was going through and looking through my sales automation tools, refining my campaigns, seeing what had worked from my A/B test the previous week and updating those. So it started to take its toll first on my mental health, in the sense that when I was number one, I always felt like I didn't have enough of a gap between me and the number two person. And when the times where I was not number one, be it for a week or a quarter, or in my last year, it was for the first 11 and a half months of that year, I always just felt like I was not good enough for myself. And this was entirely an internal pressure. And as you would imagine, this manifested in my personal life as well. I want to say I was very single through that whole period of my life, like the most single I've ever been.
Sure.
I did make a very close friend that miraculously has stayed with me and is still my best friend to this day. But we went through some tough moments and it was mostly driven by me pushing him away, because he would want to do something rational, like go to a bar on a Friday or go to a concert on a Tuesday. And I just wanted to work. Yeah. And I made it clear to him in some really brutal ways that I'm not proud of, that was my number one priority.
Did you feel like you got, you mentioned something about the gap not being big enough. Did that harken back to your athletic days? Did you say you were a runner or you played athlete? Did anything of that show up there, that type of feeling?
I love that question, particularly because I should clarify, when I say I was a runner, I was not a competitive athlete by any stretch. I just loved running. Okay. And I had felt my whole life up to that point, I was a theater nerd. And at one point for a couple years in high school, I was a gamer. I was never an athlete. So for me, the unlock in college was that I actually had a body that was capable of doing athletic things. And that was just mind blowing to me. But in a sense, yes, it did make me fiercely competitive, because I recalled all those times when I was younger where, I had been lapped by kids on the playground when we were running our mile in 7th grade. And I did not handle that well. Right. So coming forward to my time in sales at LinkedIn, a big part of that desire to be number one was kind of my own need to prove to myself that it was something that I was capable of doing, but much to my own fault.
Right. And so you kept proving it again and again, because you kept winning and you kept being number one. But did the law of diminishing returns kick in? You weren't getting the same high anymore that you got in the early victories, or was it still the same high? Did your relationship to that type of success change over time? Yes,
to some extent it did. I I mean, I still to this day love winning just as much as I did when I was 20, and tasted that perfect bite of spiced sweet potato ice cream just as much as when I closed the biggest deal of my career, et cetera, et cetera. But it started to change tone because I reached a point about 2.5 years into my sales career where I was still working these insane hours and pushing away friends. And I started to feel lonely in my personal life. But I also felt like I had established such a reputation as somebody that always needed to be number one, that I couldn't abandon that aspect of my personality without making a dramatic change in my life.
Was it addictive? Was it addictive on some level?
Immensely addictive.
Okay.
Immensely. So at that point, the way that my relationship with winning didn't change, but the way that I perceived winning changed. The criteria for winning changed. Because it also dawned on me that, hey, I'm a couple years into this. There's a great path for me to stay in sales at LinkedIn for another 10 years. Or at that point, I'd entertained a few different external recruiting calls with companies that I had sold to before that wanted to hire top sales talent. I realized, like, man, I could make so much money doing this for a long time. But then I remembered that time that I had been happiest, where I did feel balance. And that was as an entrepreneur, tasting that spiced sweet potato ice cream. And it kind of dawned on me that this 10-year path in sales, or this 20-year path, whatever it might be, is not going to take me back to that point. This might help me become a VP of sales, but it's not going to make me a successful founder, and it's not going to help me get closer to the type of impact that I want to create. So then at that moment, it was, call it a breaking point. This is maybe July of 2016. There might have even been a couple moments, because I was journaling a lot of the time, where I just realized that I have to change something. Yeah. So I decided I needed to find a way out of sales. And that was really where I had to take my first very strategic move into something that was foreign, and in a way make a courageous decision to walk away from the thing where I was making tons of money, right, and was just universally regarded as the absolute best. Because I wanted to diversify my skills. I wanted to do something other than sales. And I remembered this, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sorry.
There was something that a mentor of mine had said to me, still a mentor to this day, probably wrote me in with this, but I had asked him, he was the CRO at LinkedIn at the time. I asked, like, hey, in your career dealing with entrepreneurs, where do they typically go from this? You know, they find success in their function. Do they stay in that function? Do I specialize, or do I diversify? And he used this analogy that has stuck with me forever, which I've passed on to many others that I've worked with, which was, consider your career like a pyramid. In order to build a very tall pyramid, if you want the top of that pyramid to, say, being a founder, CEO, or just even a founder of some new venture, you have to build a very wide base to have a strong foundation in that pyramid. And the way you build a wide base is not by specializing functionally, it's by doing a bunch of different things. Yeah. And at some point, because my biggest concern was, okay, so basically you're saying I need to get out of sales, but like, what about my earning potential? Mm-hmm. I'm gonna lose so much money. I mean, I've gotten used to this lifestyle. And he said, listen, in our industry, income is not linear. Instead, it hockey sticks up at specific inflection points, and you can increase the frequency of these inflection points and the intensity of these inflection points if you are diversifying your skills and making yourself more marketable. And part of doing that is having more skills. So I told my boss at LinkedIn, my sales manager, that I wanted to move into sales operations or business operations, do something that was totally back office, never talking to customers, very technical. And at LinkedIn, it was kind of an analytics function as well. And he basically looked at me like, number one, you're absolutely crazy. And number two, we can't lose you. I mean, our team is writing, half of our number is your sales this year. So we made a pact that I would stay until the end of the year. And then at that point, I really wanted his help to broker those intros with cross-functional leaders at LinkedIn to see if I could make that switch.
Let's dive into that for a second. So when you made the decision you want to get into sales ops, did you ever question it with any like 3 a.m. doubts?
All the time.
Because the logical side is saying the money, the prestige, the clarity, the runway, you see it all, right? I mean, you see a clear path. And the other one's saying, wait a minute, we're going very different. I guess the question I have for you, Austin, is authenticity something that's important to you? Even back then, like this feeling like you're being authentic to yourself and your mission?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that was where the first kind of guiding principle for me started to crystallize. And I've really lived this out throughout the rest of my career. So typically I'll use my gut to set the vision for what I want to accomplish, but I'll be highly strategic about how to get there. So to your point earlier about, is there a grand master plan? It was always my intention to use every single one of these micro experiences to build back to this vision of being an entrepreneur again, and of having the skills to do so. Another way of framing it is listening to your heart, but acting with your mind. Yeah. So at that point, I had really played out every single scenario in my head. And to the effect of something else I had mentioned earlier in de-risking this bold move that I wanted to make. Yeah, I was scared shitless. I mean, I didn't want to, I knew if I made this switch, if somehow I got hired, I was going to really suck at that function. I'd probably go down a level. I would definitely take a pay cut, and I might never get back to the point where I was making as much or I was as well regarded as I was in sales. But when I worked through the worst case scenario, well, worst case would have been I didn't get a job in sales ops. And we can talk about some of the stupid things I did to make sure that I did. But the worst case was if I tried sales ops and I didn't like it or I sucked at it, I could try to move back into sales and I would think they would take me back. Yeah. I kind of had to make a calculated choice to pursue that, knowing that this was de-risked. And the worst case was I could just go interview externally because I had already seen there was a lot of opportunity externally in sales.
And it's interesting because you were kind of morphing into an intrapreneur. Is that a fair statement? I mean, you were an entrepreneur, you joined corporate America, you were working way back that. Is that a term that resonates with you at all, intrapreneur? Once you decide to go from sales to sales ops and you decide to build the right base of your pyramid and have these micro experiences?
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting you bring that up because later on in my career, so my next couple of jobs, that started to be a much more front and center as I wanted to develop more 0 to 1 experience. But at that time, I was kind of trying to carve this path that I had never seen anyone carve before. None of the top sales reps that I had ever known had done anything other than sales. Some of them had gone into sales management, and that was something I wanted to do too. But I also kind of had to take this, again, de-risk decision to move into sales ops on the hope that the best case scenario was I could advance to the point where a couple years from that, not only would I be a great candidate for sales management, but I could also be a sales operations manager. Mm-hmm. And if I went down either of those paths and still had field sales experience and or direct sales ops experience, then a couple years after that, I'd be a great candidate for a VP of sales. Yeah. And a couple years after that, a great candidate for a CRO. So all of a sudden, it kind of started, the path started to illuminate for me. And I started to realize that the choices I was making, although they seemed really crazy in the moment, and I did end up taking a 50% pay cut, and that really sucked. Yeah. But I had this faith that this master plan would somehow bring me the returns at some point in the future.
Yeah, I love that. It's kind of like the anti-immediate gratification, right? I mean, I'm fumbling with my words here, but I respect that. You bet on yourself. And it sounds like you've had a history of betting on yourself that, if I show up, do you get a thrill out of showing up on some level? I'm sure there's fear involved as well. There could be. By a new challenge that seems overwhelming, like it's a mountain you want to climb. It's a new mountain. Does that energize you? Does that get your fire going?
Sometimes too much. Yes. Okay.
Right.
I would say in my early 20s, I was potentially even a gunslinger at times. I mean, talk about what I had done in sales. I also want to mention that there's a very dark side to being number one, which is that it's hard to get there without having a target on your back at all times. Mm-hmm. And part of what people were saying about me was very true, that all I cared about was being the best. And as a result, it was hard for me to take my blinders off and think about what it would take to empower the team. And that became kind of disgusting to me at one point too, because I didn't want to be the lone wolf. I didn't want to just be the top sales rep. I wanted to help inspire others to achieve a shared objective. And that wasn't something I was getting in sales. But to the point of kind of betting on myself, probably the craziest thing that I did in the process of switching from sales to sales ops was so I mentioned that I kind of made it through that last year with my manager's blessing, advanced blessing, that he would help to get me into sales ops. But come January of 2017, I was like, all right, it's been 3 years straight. Number one, I'm ready to do this thing. What kind of intros can you make? And he's like, well, wait a second, maybe let's give it one more quarter, because I'm still taking a quota for your headcount, and you've got a couple of deals that are in the works. And I decided, in kind of my brazen, self-oriented, impatient mindset, that the best way to make this change was to resign. So I handed in my resignation to my manager and said, my last day is going to be in 6 weeks.
but you meant it, right? I mean, was it brazen though, or was it bold? You know, sometimes to make these big decisions, courage only lasts for so long. You sense that you have to do something. Or was it maybe a combination?
You know, I look back on this experience, and I would never do something like that today. I've had the chance to do some of these things later in my career, and I think I really got lucky in that moment, because there was a way to make that shift without burning some bridges. And I just did not choose that route. Instead, I told my manager and his boss, like, hey, you're not helping me right now as fast as I'd like it, so I'm going to quit. But I'd also like you to give me what's called an OKR plan. So I basically want you to pay me 100% of my commissions so that I have the space and time to look for a new job within LinkedIn. Because I suspect that you value me enough as an employee that you'll make this deal with me. And I think both of them, looking back on it, were basically like, go to hell, but we also want what's best for you. They cared about me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's because they cared about me.
Despite yourself.
It's despite myself. It wasn't because, you know, I was some superstar employee and anybody was lucky to have me, as much as my ego would have wanted me to believe that. The truth was they just cared about me. Yeah. So they're like, okay, you're crazy. We'll talk to you about this some other day when you're in a better place. But yeah, you can resign. But in doing so, you'll give up your position at President's Club. Your name won't be on the screen. You won't get the recognition. And I took that deal. So it ended up being, I interviewed for 7 roles at LinkedIn in the span of those 6 weeks. I took a Code Academy course on SQL. I took a couple of different LinkedIn learning courses. It was at the time called lynda.com in Excel. And in fact, the one sales ops role I was most excited about, I was using a MacBook Air, the standard sales equipment, to take this Excel test, and it crashed in the middle of the test. And it was the one role that I was farthest along in the process for. So on February 20th, with 8 days to go before I was unemployed, I just instantly failed that interview. Yeah. So I, on kind of a hope and a prayer, just reached out to one more team at LinkedIn, and then put all of my eggs in the basket of this one team that ended up giving me an offer on the 28th. And when I say they gave me an offer, I mean, the timing was so tight that the manager called and said, hey, I know your last day is today. We have to give you an exploding offer. And that's just because of the timing of your resignation. It's not what I want to do, but we're going to give you this opportunity to join sales ops as an analyst, and you have until tomorrow to sign.
Which was, in some ways, right along with your timeline, right? So, right.
It was. Oh gosh, I'm partly ashamed even to admit what happened next. So, of course, I was immensely grateful. I mean, it was happening. I had escaped unemployment, and in a sense, I had gotten my wish. But then I went back to the manager the next day, and of course, when I walked in the morning, my badge didn't work. My email was deactivated. I was terminated as an employee.
Because
totally is just a complication.
Right, because at midnight the paperwork had gone through and they had deactivated, right, your access, physical.
That's right.
Interesting.
But
so you got a taste of it though. You still had a job, but you got a taste of it. Yeah,
I did, and this is the point where God, I cringe to say this, but I think it's an important piece of the story. So I went into the manager the next day and said, I am so excited to join your team, but I think this is the wrong level. And I'll sign this offer today if I can get one level higher.
Oh boy. I mean, you're gambling on top of gambling. Right. Okay.
And I would never have done this at any other point in my career.
What drove that? Somehow, what drove that? Like what? I mean, you just escaped, you crossed thin ice, you made it to the other side, and then you take a step back on the ice again. What drove that?
In a sense, I think it was I had pushed myself to the point of no return.
Yeah.
And I had already fully embraced it. This is part of the mental game to make these bold choices. I was fully prepared for the worst case scenario. I was completely ready to walk away from the offer, to not get a job in sales ops, and to go take a position as a individually contributing sales rep at some other company, or to come begging back to my original manager and say, I made a terrible mistake, please take me back. And even in that case, if they said no, which I would respect, to then go and try to get a job elsewhere. I was ready for that scenario, so I took the risk.
So you had, as a leader, and in our last few minutes, I want to get into your final step with where you ended up next and what you're doing now, which is super exciting. There's been a lot of big decisions in your life in here in the last few weeks, which is really exciting. Do you see yourself in people that you now manage? That boldness, brashness, aggressiveness, you love them, they're not doing it right, but you care about them. Do you see some of yourself in the folks coming up on your teams?
Sometimes I do. I think it's hard not to. And I also think that we often have biases as leaders to look for those things in other people and sometimes even to create them when they're not there. So it's hard to say. Over the years, maybe 50% have been false positives, where I've seen some evidence of behavior that maybe I would have shown when I was 22 or 23 and crushing it in sales. And I've used that pyramid analogy often to help people gain perspective. If they're saying, I want to run a company or I want to be a VP of sales, yet they're an onboarding specialist and have been doing that for 5 years and don't have a desire, aren't doing the things to get promoted, et cetera. I've definitely tried to lean into that old advice.
Okay. Yeah.
So I will say in some senses too, the few cases where I have seen the exact same behaviors and where it was not a false positive, I did see the same type of person. I mean, that's just exciting, right? Because then, I would imagine someday I hope to be a parent. Right now, I'm not. So I just want to put that big asterisk in the way there. But it's so enriching to be able to help to guide someone away from the pitfalls of your own mistakes.
Yeah, I agree.
And at that time, I had known when I was making these choices early in my career, I really did not have. I had a board of directors, so to speak, mentors I could go to for advice on how to approach it. My mom is the number one on that board, but none of them had ever been in sales at LinkedIn and had that performance and that reputation, and then tried to do kind of an ego refresh and a career refresh. So sometimes later on, I was a sales operations and later a sales leader for Caviar, the business, the third-party marketplace food delivery service while it's part of Square. And I had the chance to work with some people that had both sales and sales ops experience, many of whom wanted to kind of create a similar narrative to mine. And I really leaned into those moments.
You did, right? Okay. In a way of being of service to them. Is that correct? Like in a way of trying to help them and guide them. Is that what I'm picking up on?
Well, absolutely. Particularly because when I moved from LinkedIn over to Square, that was my first chance with management. Yeah. And I'll skip past some of the finer details of that, but I had a once in a lifetime, perhaps, chance to step into a big leadership role within just a few months of starting my journey at Square. And a big part of that was because there was a vacuum for sales leadership, and I had both operating experience with a sales team and I had direct field sales experience. So eventually that risk that I'd taken several years back paid off. Finally, I was making the same amount that I had been in sales. So financially, I was made whole. But my potential was so much greater because beyond that point, I could lead a sales team. I could lead an ops team, an onboarding function, customer success. And I had also really tapped into that part of myself that was team oriented. And that came from being bad at sales ops, if I'm being honest.
Look, I love your story and I love your honesty, 100%. Did the fear leave you? You were living with a lot of fear, it sounds like, when you had the bullseye on your back, being number one in sales for 3 years. Did that fear subside as you took on different roles and you built a broader set of experience?
It did. It absolutely did. I started to feel a much greater sense of balance, particularly once I had made it to Square and was managing a large team through a lot of the same things that I had done previously as an individual contributor, because all of a sudden it wasn't a me versus them scenario. And I no longer felt there's no target on my back. I don't need to prove anything to myself. I had already proven some of those most important things. And even more importantly, I didn't need to prove things to other people. So the only thing I cared about was the team.
So it sounds like it was a more relaxed intensity.
Absolutely.
Still intense, but just a more relaxed. Yeah, right. Okay.
Right. Well, my success became predicated on the success of my teams. The best part of my 2019 was getting my star employee promoted into the job of his dreams. And I had never experienced something like that before. And God, it was so much more fulfilling to have that experience than to be number one in sales.
Yeah. No, I love it. I'm the same way. I like being on service stars. We had a show with someone else recently that we're going to be publishing soon, and he's helped 50% of the people work for him get promoted.
Gosh.
And he said, look, it's not, I can't take anyone and turn them into a rock star, right? But 50% of the people that have worked underneath me have gotten and received a promotion. And it's the thing I'm the most proud of. And this is a super successful sales leader. So I agree. I think that's the next level of satisfaction. What have you been doing, Austin, in the last year or so, and where are you heading now?
So eventually the Caviar business was acquired from Square by DoorDash. And my role in 2020 was integrating all of our infrastructure and supporting our merchants through the transition from one technical backend to another. At the end of that, my role was eliminated. And I had a choice to stay at DoorDash and look for a new role or to leave. And I kind of felt like there was just something else that I wanted to try before I took this full voyage into entrepreneurship. And that was true 0 to 1 experimentation. Mm-hmm. So again, I kind of had this playbook ready. I knew what it was like to move from a role where I felt like a hot shot and all of a sudden was just knocked on my ass and working my way from scratch. So I went from managing this big team at Caviar to being an individual contributor in product operations, focusing on new segments and new sales narratives for a brand new product. So it was kind of the trifecta of the newest of the new within this scaled business of DoorDash. So for the last year, I was helping to find product market fit within new segments. And recently I just made the decision that it was time to entertain entrepreneurship once again. Yeah.
Okay. That's super exciting. I mean, you've come full circle. You spent 10 years. I mean, did it feel like this 10 years of corporate experience was like an, entrepreneurial graduate school, right? Like you got to test things and try things and end up in product market fit and lead people. And it just seems like you picked up so many phenomenal skill sets along the way.
I think so. And it's hard to say because there's a part of me that'll always wonder what could have been if I had just kept to my wits at the time that we had our raw desserts company was what it was called. And we had our frozen desserts business. I wonder what that could have looked like today. And the reason I say that is there have been a lot of businesses that have grown into multi-million, hundreds of $1,000,000 companies with this exact same business model. And those weren't even around at the time.
Yeah.
But I also know that had I not gone through this professional graduate school, to use your term, I probably would not have developed. I wouldn't have the same self-awareness over my tendency towards self-orientation in the early part of my career. I wouldn't have experienced the type of fulfillment that I now see from leading others to achieve their dreams versus just achieving my own. And it also wouldn't have put me in so many uncomfortable situations within the kind of safety net and economic security of an organization that would allow me to take those risks later on. So I always sit along that point, and it really the one thing that I try to impart to any team that I'm a part of, my biggest belief is that growth sits at the frontier of your comfort zone. And for the last 5 years in particular, the number one priority was putting myself in the most uncomfortable position where I still felt like there was a chance of being successful. I didn't want to be number one anymore. I wanted to be kind of middle of the pack with line of sight to be number one, before which, I try to go find the next thing to be really bad at.
It sounds like number one was redefined for you. It went from being an individual number one to a team number one. It sounds like number one, maybe it morphed into something greater or something different for you.
Yes. In the last year,
definition of winning changed. I don't know, but
well, the biggest thing is winning before had been, again, that kind of me versus them scenario, and now winning to me is creating impact. The way that it's been easiest to do so in the past few years has been mentoring and coaching teammates. But you can also create impact by bringing a product to a segment of customer that is underserved. And I felt a lot of fulfillment this year by listening to testimonials from customers that were saying, hey, you helped save me X tens of thousands of dollars to improve our run rate by 5% just by introducing this new product. So as I go into this next chapter in entrepreneurship, I don't care about being wealthy. I don't care about managing a team. This could be something that I just do with my co-founder. It could be something that turns into nothing. But if there is a measurable impact, then it will have felt like winning. And everything else that I've gone through to get to that point will have been completely worth it.